Hey everyone, welcome back to all our loyal subscribers and a big hello to all the new faces here. If this is your first time tuning in, you're in the perfect place for some guaranteed chills. But before you get too comfortable, take a second to drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see where our spooky community comes from. Tonight, we're diving into a collection of terrifying stories that will make you look over your shoulder. So before the fear kicks in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be the first to know when a new chilling story is released. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. I've got a little challenge for you. Let's blow up this channel and surpass our subscriber count by 100. Share this video with someone who loves a good thrill, or someone who thinks they never get scared. Let me know in the comments which story scared you the most. And hang tight. The best is yet to come. Ready for your next dose of chills? Let's dive in. Solo hiking has always been my refuge, a way to disconnect from the world, clear my mind, and immerse myself in the beauty of nature. There's nothing like the feeling of being alone on a trail, surrounded by the quiet hum of the forest, with no distractions or responsibilities pulling at you. It was that craving for solitude that led me to Utah's Wasatch National Forest, a place I had long dreamed of exploring. But what began as a peaceful escape quickly spiraled into a terrifying ordeal that still haunts me to this day. After a painful breakup with the woman I thought I would marry, I decided to take a solo road trip across the country. I needed time and space to process everything, and hiking seemed like the perfect way to do that. I packed my gear, filled my car with snacks and supplies, and hit the open road, determined to put some distance between me and my old life. Utah was one of my planned stops, and I was particularly excited about it because of its vast, unspoiled landscapes and endless hiking opportunities. I arrived at Wasatch National Forest early in the morning, eager to get started. The forest was breathtaking tall, ancient trees that seemed to stretch endlessly towards the sky, lush undergrowth, and the fresh, crisp scent of pine in the air. It was everything I had hoped for and more. I chose a remote trail, one that wasn't marked on any official maps, and drove my car as far down a narrow, rutted access road as I could manage. I parked, stepped out, and took a deep breath, letting the tranquility of the forest wash over me. I geared up, double-checked my backpack, and made sure I had everything I needed for the day ahead. I checked my phone one last time, no service, just as I had expected. That was fine by me. I wasn't here to be glued to my phone. I locked my car, tucked the keys into my pack, and set off down the trail, my spirits high and my mind focused on the journey ahead. I had a digital map downloaded on my phone, and although there was no cell service, the GPS function would still work, allowing me to navigate even in the most remote areas. The first hour of the hike was perfect. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense stands of pine and fir, with the occasional clearing that offered stunning views of the surrounding mountains. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches swaying in the breeze, and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It was exactly what I needed, a complete break from reality, where the only thing I had to worry about was putting one foot in front of the other. As I climbed higher, the trail became steeper and more rugged, but I didn't mind. I was used to rough terrain, and I welcomed the physical exertion. It felt good to push my body, to feel my muscles working as I navigated over rocks and roots. I had planned my route carefully, hiked to a lookout point at the summit of a nearby mountain, about 4 miles away, taken the views, and then head back to my car before dusk. I was in no rush, enjoying the journey as much as the destination. About an hour into the hike, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in seemingly out of nowhere, and the temperature dropped noticeably. A light rain started to fall, its pitter-patter against the leaves breaking the forest's peaceful silence. I don't mind getting wet, but hiking in the rain is one of my pet peeves. It makes everything more difficult, from the slippery trails to the soggy gear. I paused to assess my options. The trail ahead was steep and rocky, and with the rain coming down, it would only get more treacherous. Annoyed but practical, I decided to turn back and retrace my steps to the car. The hike back was uneventful at first. I was moving at a steady pace, eager to get out of the rain and back to the warmth of my car. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed darker and more foreboding, the rain adding an extra layer of chill to the air. I kept my head down, focused on the trail, mentally planning my next move. But as I approached the area where I had parked, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a sense of unease crept over me. When my car finally came into view, I felt a wave of relief until I got closer and realized something was terribly wrong. All 4 of my tires were flat, not just deflated but slashed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. My mind raced as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of who might have done this. The forest was still and silent, save for the steady drumming of rain on the leaves. I felt exposed and vulnerable, standing out in the open with no cover and no way to escape. Panic began to set in as the reality of my situation sank in. Without cell service, I couldn't call for help, and with my tires slashed, I was completely stranded. The nearest town was miles away, and the thought of walking back down the long, deserted access road seemed daunting, especially with the rain coming down harder now. I needed a plan, and I needed one fast. I decided that my best chance was to reach higher ground where I might be able to get a phone signal. The summit I had originally planned to hike to was now my only hope. I turned back towards the trail, my heart racing. The idea of heading deeper into the forest, knowing that someone had already targeted me, was terrifying. But staying with my disabled car felt like an even worse idea. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath, and started hiking back up the trail, moving as quickly as I could without risking a fall on the slick, uneven ground. The rain had let up slightly, but the forest felt darker and more oppressive, the shadows lengthening as the day wore on. As I climbed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone was out there, hidden among the trees, watching my every move. About halfway to the summit, I heard a faint rustling noise coming from behind me, about 40 yards back. I stopped and listened, and the rustling stopped too. I took a few more steps, and the noise resumed, perfectly in sync with my movements. My heart pounded as I realized that someone or something was following me, staying just out of sight. I picked up my pace, trying to stay calm and keep my breathing steady. The sun was starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The rain had reduced to a light drizzle, but the dampness clung to me, making every step feel heavy and sluggish. I pushed on, adrenaline surging through my veins, knowing that I needed to get to the summit as quickly as possible. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, and every step felt like it could be my last. The climb to the summit was grueling, but I didn't dare slow down. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, resisting the urge to look back. The rustling continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never disappearing entirely. Whoever was following me was playing a sick game, keeping just enough distance to remain unseen but close enough to keep me on edge. As I neared the summit, the forest began to thin out, and I felt a faint sense of relief. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, and by some miracle, I had one bar. I quickly dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained my situation to the operator. She stayed calm, talking me through what I needed to do and assuring me that help was on the way. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope, but the operator's voice couldn't drown out the dread that still lingered. I knew I wasn't safe yet. The operator advised me to stay put, but the thought of lingering at the exposed summit, with darkness rapidly approaching, made my skin crawl. I decided I couldn't just wait there. I needed to make my way back to my car, but I had to be smart about it. Taking the same route down felt too dangerous. Whoever was stalking me knew that path as well as I did now. I studied my map, looking for an alternate route, and decided to try a different angle, hoping to avoid any ambushes. I started down the new path, moving cautiously but quickly. The rain had almost stopped, but the ground was still slick, and every step required careful navigation. The forest was quiet again, but the silence was far from comforting. I listened intently, ears straining for any sign that my pursuer was still out there. The feeling of being watched was palpable, like a weight pressing down on me, urging me to move faster. As I made my way through the dense underbrush, the rustling started again, this time more erratic and aggressive. I could hear footsteps now, the sound unmistakable and terrifyingly close. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth or noise. My only thought was to get back to my car, to get somewhere safe. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my breath ragged and my legs burning with the effort. The footsteps behind me grew louder, matching my pace, and I knew whoever was back there wasn't trying to hide anymore. They were chasing me. Branches whipped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I pushed through the pain and fear. I could see the clearing ahead, the spot where I had parked my car. I was almost there, but so were they. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw movement figures in the shadows, closing in. My heart pounded in my ears, and I forced myself to keep running, fueled by sheer adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. I burst into the clearing, my car in sight. But it wasn't the sight of my car that stopped me, it was the flashing lights of a police cruiser parked right behind it. I stumbled towards it, collapsing against the side as an officer rushed out to help me. I turned back to the forest, expecting to see my pursuers emerge, but there was nothing. The forest was still again, the threat seemingly vanished. The officer listened as I breathlessly recounted my story, his expression shifting from concern to something darker. He explained that the area was known for strange, isolated groups who lived off the grid, people who didn't take kindly to outsiders. He mentioned cults and religious extremists who used the remote woods to conduct their activities away from prying eyes. According to him, I had likely stumbled into one of their territories, and they had tried to scare me off. The slashed tires, the stalking, it was all part of their warning. I left Utah the next morning, my car repaired and my nerves shattered. The experience haunted me for weeks, every sound and shadow triggering memories of that night in the forest. I had gone looking for an escape, but instead, I found a chilling reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I still hike, but now I'm more cautious, more aware of the risks. The allure of the wild is still there, but so is the memory of what it felt like to be hunted. That trip changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It taught me that the wilderness, for all its beauty, is not always a place of peace. Sometimes it's a place where the line between being alone and being vulnerable becomes dangerously thin. And sometimes it's a place where the things you're running from aren't just in your head, they're right behind you, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The haunting of Dudley Town Forest. Exploring forgotten places has always fascinated me. There's something thrilling about venturing into locations shrouded in mystery, places that most people avoid due to their eerie reputations. One such place is Dudley Town Forest in Connecticut, an abandoned ghost town with a sinister history and an atmosphere that makes your skin crawl. For years, I had heard stories of strange happenings in Dudley Town, reports of ghost sightings, unexplained noises, and a haunting silence that seems to swallow all sound. It was the perfect destination for an adventure, or so I thought. What started as a quest for a little excitement quickly turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. I had always been curious about Dudley Town. Officially, it's off limits to the public, but that's never been much of a deterrent for me. I've explored many places where I wasn't technically supposed to be, and the thrill of stepping into forbidden territory only adds to the appeal. The stories about Dudley Town were intriguing. An abandoned settlement that had been left to decay since the 1800s, rumored to be cursed, and with a long history of strange and tragic events. People spoke of an unnatural silence in the forest, an absence of wildlife, and an oppressive atmosphere that made visitors feel like they were constantly being watched. I decided to take the plunge and visit Dudley Town on a quiet Saturday morning. The drive wasn't too far from where I lived, and I figured I could spend a few hours exploring and be back before dark. I packed my gear, including my trusty trail markers, small, bright stickers that I use to mark my path when I'm in unfamiliar territory. It's a trick that saved me from getting lost more times than I can count. I also brought along a flashlight, a pocket knife, and some snacks, just the basics for a short hike. As I neared the entrance to Dudley Town, I felt a flutter of excitement mixed with a hint of apprehension. The forest loomed ahead, dense and dark, even in the midday sun. The entrance was marked by a rickety old sign that warned trespassers to keep out, but it was clear that many others had ignored the warning. There were signs of foot traffic, worn paths through the underbrush, and the occasional beer can or candy wrapper left behind by previous explorers. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and stepped into the forest, ready to uncover its secrets. From the moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel that something was off. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It was as if the entire area was holding its breath, waiting. I pressed on, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. I started placing my trail markers every few yards, bright stickers that clung to tree trunks, guiding my path. It was a habit I had developed after getting lost on a hike a few years back, and it gave me a sense of security, knowing that I could always find my way back. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the silence grew more oppressive. Every step I took seemed to echo loudly in the stillness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone or something peeking out from behind the thick trunks. But there was nothing, just the endless rows of trees, standing like silent sentinels. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the creepy stories about Dudley Town get to me. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that hung over me like a heavy fog. I continued along the overgrown path, my eyes scanning the ground for any signs of the town that once stood here. According to what I had read, Dudley Town was founded in the early 1700s and quickly fell into ruin due to a series of misfortunes, crop failures, epidemics, and mysterious deaths that led to whispers of a curse. By the 1800s, the settlement was abandoned, and the forest reclaimed the land, leaving only a few crumbling foundations and scattered artifacts to mark its existence. I was eager to find these remnants, to see for myself the evidence of a place that seemed to be lost to time. About an hour into my hike, I came across the first signs of the old town. Hidden among the trees, I spotted the remains of a stone foundation, partially buried under layers of moss and fallen leaves. I crouched down to take a closer look, running my fingers over the rough, weathered stones. It was hard to imagine that this quiet, desolate spot was once someone's home, filled with the sounds of daily life. Now, it was just a ghostly reminder of a past long forgotten. I took a few photos and continued on, my interest piqued by the discovery. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon more remnants, crumbling walls, rusted tools, and the occasional piece of shattered pottery. It was like piecing together a puzzle of a lost civilization, each fragment telling a small part of a larger, darker story. But as fascinating as these discoveries were, they did little to dispel the unsettling atmosphere that clung to the forest. The deeper I went, the more the silence seemed to press in on me, suffocating in its intensity. I tried to focus on the thrill of exploration, but my mind kept drifting back to the stories I had heard about Dudley Town, the strange noises, the inexplicable feelings of dread, and the sightings of shadowy figures that vanished as soon as they were spotted. I had dismissed those tales as exaggerated rumors, but standing there in the heart of the forest, I began to wonder if there was more truth to them than I had initially thought. As I navigated through a particularly dense thicket, I heard a low, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It sounded like a wail, long and drawn out, like the cry of an animal in pain. I froze, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest, far off the path I was on. I told myself it was just the wind, even though the air was still and there was no breeze to speak of. The noise faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me in silence once more. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to continue. The smart thing to do would have been to turn back, to follow my markers and head for the safety of my car. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I had come this far, and I wanted to see more. I pushed the eerie noise from my mind and pressed on, my footsteps crunching loudly on the leaf-strewn ground. As I continued, I came across something that made my blood run cold. Carvings etched into the trunks of several trees. They were crude symbols, unlike anything I had ever seen before. Some were just random slashes, while others looked like twisted, contorted faces, their expressions frozen in perpetual agony. The carvings were deep, cutting through the bark and into the heartwood, as if whoever had made them had done so with anger or desperation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that these carvings weren't old, they were recent, the edges still sharp and fresh. I pulled out my phone and took a few photos, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady the camera. The forest felt different now, more menacing, as if it was watching me with a newfound intensity. I decided it was time to turn back. I had seen enough, and the last thing I wanted was to be caught in the dark, surrounded by those strange, haunting symbols. I started retracing my steps, following the trail markers I had placed earlier. But after a few minutes, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Some of my markers were missing. I was certain I had placed them at regular intervals, but now there were gaps, long stretches of unmarked trees that made it difficult to find my way. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe I had just missed them in my haste, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I continued on, my pace quickening as I tried to make sense of the missing markers. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming larger and the path growing narrower. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of my markers, but they were nowhere to be found. My sense of direction faltered, and I felt the first stirrings of panic begin to set in. I was lost. As I wandered through the maze of trees, I heard the wailing sound again, this time closer and more insistent. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trunks and disorienting me further. I spun around trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a jog, desperate to find my way out of this nightmare. In my frantic search for the trail, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold: a cave, partially hidden by thick foliage. It wasn't large, just a dark gash in the side of a small hill, but there was something about it that filled me with dread. The entrance was surrounded by more of those strange carvings, and I could see that the symbols extended inside, covering the walls of the cave. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. As I turned to go, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. I bolted, sprinting through the underbrush, my legs pumping furiously as I tried to outrun whatever was following me. The footsteps grew louder, matching my pace, and I knew that I was being chased. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, but I didn't dare slow down. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between me and that cave as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I burst through the tree line and into a clearing. My car was just ahead, parked where I had left it at the edge of the forest. I didn't stop running until I reached the door, fumbling with the keys in my haste to get inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I sped away, the tires kicking up gravel as I tore down the road. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally pulled over, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees that lined the highway, half expecting to see something step out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the engine and the distant chirping of birds. I had escaped, but the sense of unease lingered, a reminder of what I had encountered in Dudley Town forest. I still think about that day, replaying the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. I've done my best to rationalize it, to chalk it up to nerves and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know there was something else in that forest, something that defied explanation. I've since learned that some places are better left unexplored, their secrets buried in the shadows where they belong. Dudley Town was one of those places, a haunting reminder that the past never truly dies, and that some mysteries are best left unsolved. The forest may be quiet, but it's far from empty. Whatever lurks within those trees, watching from the darkness, is still out there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far from the beaten path. And as for me, I've learned to listen to that nagging voice of caution, the one that tells you when it's time to turn back before it's too late. The reservoir encounter. Growing up in a quiet suburban town, my friends and I always sought out places where we could hang out away from the prying eyes of adults. For us, that place was the reservoir, a large, secluded body of water surrounded by woods, far enough from town that we could do whatever we wanted without being disturbed. The reservoir was our sanctuary, a spot we had claimed as our own, filled with good memories of summer days spent swimming, fishing, and just goofing off. But one night, everything changed, and our beloved hideaway turned into the setting of our worst nightmare. It was a humid summer evening, and boredom had set in. We were at my house, the usual hangout spot for our group of 5: me, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan. My dad's basement was our makeshift clubhouse, complete with a pool table, an old couch, and a mini fridge stocked with beer. But after hours of playing pool and listening to music, we were restless and itching for something more adventurous. That's when Chester suggested we head out to the reservoir. The idea immediately sparked excitement. It had been a while since we'd gone there, and the weather was perfect for an evening by the water. We grabbed a couple of beers, threw on our sneakers, and set off through the woods that bordered my backyard. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the trees, and the thought of spending the evening at our favorite spot felt like the perfect way to wrap up the day. The walk to the reservoir took about 20 minutes, winding through dense woods and across a narrow dirt road that few people used. The path was well worn, a testament to the countless times we had made this trek over the years. As we walked, we talked and laughed, the mood light and carefree. We reached the familiar chain-link fence that surrounded the reservoir, slipping through one of the many gaps we had cut over the years. Beyond the fence, the reservoir stretched out before us, its surface smooth and still, reflecting the vibrant colors of the setting sun. We made our way to the far side of the reservoir, a secluded spot we like to call the beach. It wasn't really a beach, more like a small, flat area of smooth rocks right by the water's edge, but it was our beach, and that was all that mattered. We sat down, popped open our beers, and settled in, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. The only sounds were the occasional croak of a frog and the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. It was perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened, the mood shifted from lively to relaxed. We talked about everything and nothing, the way you do with close friends. I was in the middle of telling a story about a camping trip gone wrong when Hassan, who was facing the water, suddenly went quiet. His expression changed, his eyes narrowing as he stared across the reservoir. We followed his gaze, trying to see what had caught his attention. "Do you guys see that?" Hassan asked, his voice low. At first, we didn't see anything unusual, just the dark water and the shadowy outline of trees on the other side. But then, as our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we noticed something moving along the far shore. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but there was definitely a figure, slow and deliberate in its movements, dragging something heavy behind it. We squinted, straining to see more clearly, and soon realized what it was: a person, pulling a large, black garbage bag toward the water's edge. The sight of it sent a chill through me. It wasn't just the presence of a stranger that was unsettling, it was the way they moved, so methodically, as if they were on a mission. The bag looked bulky, weighed down by something substantial. We all fell silent, watching intently as the person reached the water and began to maneuver the bag into the reservoir. The whole scene felt wrong, like we were witnessing something we shouldn't be. After a few moments, another figure emerged from the woods, then another, until there were 4 of them, all dressed in dark clothing that made them blend into the shadows. 2 of them were carrying similar bags, while the third held a small kayak. They moved with purpose, working together to load the bags onto the kayak, one by one. The first person climbed into the kayak and began to paddle out to the middle of the reservoir, the bag balanced precariously on their lap. We watched, frozen in place, as the kayak reached the deepest part of the reservoir. The person in the kayak paused for a moment, then tilted the bag over the side, letting it slip beneath the surface with barely a splash. They repeated this process with the other bags, each one disappearing into the dark water without a trace. It was surreal, like something out of a movie, and none of us could quite believe what we were seeing. As the last bag sank into the depths, my phone rang loudly, shattering the tense silence. The sudden noise startled all of us, and in my panic I fumbled to mute it. The 4 figures across the reservoir froze, their heads snapping in our direction. For a moment, there was a terrible stillness, the kind that makes your stomach drop. Then, as if on cue, they began to move fast. They grabbed the kayak and their gear, heading straight for our side of the reservoir. "Run," Chester yelled, his voice breaking the spell that had kept us rooted to the spot. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline kicking in as we sprinted back towards the fence. The woods that had always felt like home now seemed like a maze designed to trap us. The path was uneven and littered with roots and rocks, making every step a potential fall. We could hear the sounds of our pursuers crashing through the underbrush behind us, their footsteps heavy and determined. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, the fear of what might happen if we were caught pushing me to move faster than I ever thought possible. I could hear Rick shouting something, but the words were lost in the chaos. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of one of the figures, dressed in black and gaining on us. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't afford to slow down. We reached the fence, and I threw myself against it, frantically searching for the gap we had used to get in. The darkness made everything look the same, and I felt a surge of panic as I realized I couldn't find the opening. The others were right behind me, their breaths ragged and panicked, and I knew we were running out of time. Just when I was about to give up, Chester spotted the gap and pointed it out. We scrambled through, one by one, squeezing through the narrow opening with seconds to spare. Once we were on the other side, we kept running, not daring to look back. The trees blurred past, and the only thought in my mind was to get as far away from the reservoir as possible. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods and into the safety of my backyard. We collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling from the exertion and the fear. It felt like we had just escaped a nightmare, but the reality of what had happened was all too real. Hassan pulled out his phone and called the police, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what we had seen. We all gathered around, listening as he spoke, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. The police assured us that they would send a squad car to my house immediately, and that they would investigate the reservoir. As we waited, we kept glancing nervously towards the woods, half expecting the figures to appear at any moment. When the police arrived, they took our statements and assured us that we were safe. They searched my property for any signs that we had been followed, and my stomach dropped when they found something, a set of muddy footprints leading right up to the fence at the edge of my yard. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions grim. They asked if we were sure the prints weren't ours, and I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. Why would any of us jump our own backyard fence? The police promised to keep an eye on the area and to update us on their investigation. Over the next few days, we were on edge, jumping at every little noise and constantly looking over our shoulders. The reservoir, once our sanctuary, now felt tainted, a place where something dark had happened. We watched the local news, hoping for some kind of explanation, but none came. Then, about a week later, the police made a discovery that confirmed our worst fears. They had fished 3 bodies out of the reservoir, all wrapped in garbage bags, just like the ones we had seen. The story was all over the news, and it sent shockwaves through our small town. The police conducted a thorough investigation, but they never found any solid leads. The identities of the victims were never released, and no arrests were made. It was as if the whole thing had been a terrible, unsolvable mystery. My friends and I struggled to move on, haunted by the knowledge that we had come so close to something so sinister. The reservoir was officially closed off, the fence reinforced, and signs warning against trespassing were put up everywhere. But none of that could erase what we had seen. For months, my parents were terrified that whoever was responsible might come after us. My mom swore she saw people in the woods at night, even claiming to have seen a camera flash through the trees on more than one occasion. We never found out if those fears were justified, but the paranoia lingered. Eventually, my family decided to move, citing safety concerns as one of the main reasons. It felt like a chapter of our lives had been forcibly closed, and the reservoir became a forbidden topic among us. The years have passed since that night, but the memories remain vivid. I still drive by the reservoir sometimes, though I never stop. It's overgrown now, the once familiar paths swallowed up by weeds and brush. The fence is still there, rusting and leaning in places, a feeble barrier between the world and whatever secrets the water holds. I've heard whispers of more bodies being found, and occasional stories of strange figures seen lurking by the water's edge, but I don't know if those tales are true or just the product of fearful imaginations. What I do know is that the reservoir, once a place of friendship and carefree days, has been forever changed in my mind. I can't look at it without thinking of the dark figures, the heavy bags, and the cold, calculating way they went about their business. I still wonder who they were, why they did what they did, and how many others might have stumbled upon their grim activities. But I also know that some questions are best left unanswered, and some places are better left alone. For now, the reservoir remains a silent witness to the events of that night, its waters hiding whatever truths lie beneath. And as for my friends and me, we've learned to find other places to gather, far from the shadows of our past. The world is full of secrets, and sometimes the best thing you can do is turn around and walk the other way. The reservoir chase. The summers of my childhood were always spent exploring the thick woods surrounding my family home. Our house was on the edge of a quiet, suburban town, bordered by a large stretch of forest that led to a secluded reservoir. This reservoir became a sanctuary for me and my friends, a place where we could escape the prying eyes of parents and the rules that came with them. It was our secret haven, where we felt invincible until the night when everything changed, and our childhood refuge turned into a scene of terror. It was a hot, sticky evening, one of those summer nights where the air clings to your skin and even the slightest breeze is a relief. My friends and I, Chester, Rick, Jasper, Hassan, and I were hanging out in my basement. My dad's man cave was the perfect hideout, a big screen TV, a pool table, and, most importantly, a stocked mini fridge full of cold drinks. We had spent the better part of the afternoon shooting pool, listening to music, and trying to beat the heat, but the restlessness was beginning to set in. Chester, always the adventurous one, suggested we take a walk to the reservoir. The idea instantly sparked excitement. It had been weeks since we'd last gone, and the reservoir was like a second home to us, a place where we could be loud, carefree, and totally ourselves. We grabbed a couple of beers, tossed on our sneakers, and headed out into the twilight. The path from my house to the reservoir was one we knew by heart, winding through dense trees and over uneven ground that had been worn smooth by years of our footsteps. As we trekked through the woods, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. We talked and laughed, the kind of easy banter that comes from years of friendship. By the time we reached the fence surrounding the reservoir, the sky had shifted to a deep, dusky purple, the first stars just beginning to peek through the darkness. We slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, a gap we had cut ourselves years ago, a testament to how much we had claimed this place as our own. On the other side, the reservoir stretched out before us, its surface calm and still, reflecting the last glimmers of daylight. We made our way to the far side, where a small, rocky outcrop jutted out over the water. We called it the beach, though it was really just a patch of smooth stones that made for a decent sitting spot. We settled in, cracked open our beers, and let the cool breeze off the water wash over us. It was moments like this that made all the teenage angst and drama fade away, just us, the water, and the quiet of the night. For a while, everything was perfect. We joked around, skipped rocks across the water, and talked about everything from the latest video games to plans for the future. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. But as the sky grew darker, Hassan, who was staring out across the water, suddenly went quiet. We all noticed and followed his gaze to the far side of the reservoir, where something moved in the shadows. "Do you see that?" Hassan whispered, his voice tense. We squinted into the darkness, trying to make out what he was looking at. At first, it was hard to see, just a vague shape against the dark backdrop of the woods. But then, as our eyes adjusted, we saw it, a person dragging something heavy along the shoreline. The figure moved slowly, laboring under the weight of what looked like a large, black garbage bag. It was an unsettling sight, made worse by the eerie quiet that had settled over the reservoir. As we watched, more figures emerged from the woods, each one dragging a similar bag. There were 4 of them in total, all dressed in dark clothing that made them blend almost seamlessly into the shadows. One of them carried a small, inflatable raft, which they quickly set down by the water's edge. They worked in silence, moving with a strange, methodical precision that sent chills down my spine. We huddled together, barely daring to breathe as we watched the figures load the bags into the raft. My heart pounded in my chest, the gravity of the situation sinking in. There was something undeniably wrong about what we were witnessing. It wasn't just the oddity of people at the reservoir so late at night, it was the way they moved, so deliberate and synchronized, like they had done this before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming urge to get out of there, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away. One of the figures climbed into the raft and began paddling out to the center of the reservoir, the black bags piled at their feet. They paused once they reached the deepest part, then methodically began tossing the bags overboard, one by one. The bags disappeared beneath the water with barely a sound, leaving only ripples that quickly smoothed out. The whole scene felt surreal, like a twisted performance that we were never meant to see. Just as the last bag slipped into the water, my phone, which had been tucked in my pocket, rang loudly. The sudden noise shattered the stillness and sent a jolt of panic through all of us. In my fumbling haste to silence it, I dropped the phone, its ringtone blaring in the night. The figures across the reservoir froze, their heads snapping up to look in our direction. For a split second, no one moved. Then, as if on some unspoken command, the figures sprang into action, scrambling to the shoreline and heading straight for us. "Run," Chester shouted, his voice breaking the paralysis that had gripped us. We bolted up the rocky outcrop, sprinting towards the fence with a desperation I had never felt before. The woods that had always felt so familiar now seemed like a maze of shadows and obstacles, each tree en route a potential snare. Behind us, the sound of crashing footsteps and low, urgent voices spurred us on, the reality of being chased hitting us like a cold slap to the face. My heart pounded in my ears, and every breath felt like fire in my lungs. I could hear Rick shouting something, but his words were lost in the chaos of our frantic escape. I glanced over my shoulder and saw one of the figures closing in, their silhouette moving swiftly through the trees. The fear that gripped me was unlike anything I had ever known, a primal terror that propelled me forward, faster and faster, even as my legs screamed in protest. We reached the fence, the chain link barrier looming like a final hurdle between us and safety. But in the darkness, the gap we had slipped through was impossible to find. I felt around frantically, my fingers scraping against the cold metal as I searched for the familiar opening. The sounds of our pursuers were getting closer, the crunch of their footsteps mingling with our own ragged breathing. Just when I thought we were trapped, Chester spotted the gap and shoved us towards it. We squeezed through the fence one by one, the jagged metal catching on our clothes and skin, but none of us cared. Once on the other side, we kept running, tearing through the woods with no sense of direction other than away. The branches whipped at our faces, and the underbrush snagged our feet, but the adrenaline kept us moving. We didn't stop until we stumbled out of the trees and into the relative safety of my backyard. We collapsed onto the grass, panting and shaking, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. None of us spoke for a moment, too stunned and scared to even process what we had just experienced. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold my phone as I tried to call the police. When the operator picked up, I could hardly form the words to explain what we had seen. It all sounded so insane: figures, bags, a chase through the woods, but it was real, and we were terrified. The police arrived quickly, lights flashing as they pulled into my driveway. They took our statements, asking us to recount everything we had witnessed. As we talked, they shined their flashlights along the fence and into the woods, searching for any signs of our pursuers. I felt a wave of dread when one of the officers called out, pointing to a set of muddy footprints leading right up to the fence. They weren't ours, the officers confirmed that much. Whoever had chased us had been right behind us the whole way. The police assured us that they would search the area and keep an eye on the reservoir. They promised to follow up, but days went by with no news. We were left in a state of uneasy limbo, constantly looking over our shoulders and jumping at every little noise. My parents were on high alert, my mom insisting that she saw people lurking near the edge of the woods at night. None of us slept well, the fear that those figures might come back gnawing at the edges of our sanity. Then, about a week later, the news broke. The police had found bodies in the reservoir, 3 of them, all wrapped in garbage bags, just like the ones we had seen. The discovery made headlines, and our story became part of the media frenzy. The police continued their investigation, but no arrests were made, and the identities of the victims were never released. It was as if the whole thing was shrouded in secrecy, a nightmare that had no clear answers. My friends and I tried to move on, but the experience left a lasting mark. The reservoir, once a place of laughter and adventure, now felt tainted by what we had witnessed. It was closed off to the public, the fence reinforced and new warning signs posted. But none of that could erase the images burned into our minds: the figures, the bags, the chase through the dark. I still have dreams about that night, waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing as if I were back there, running for my life. Eventually, my family decided to move, the unease too much for us to handle. We left the house and the reservoir behind, starting fresh in a new town where the shadows of that night couldn't follow us. but the memories linger. The fear of what might have happened if we hadn't gotten away still haunting me. I haven't seen my friends as much since we moved, but I know they feel it too, the weight of what we escaped, and the unanswered questions that still loom over us. Sometimes, when I'm driving through my old town, I pass by the turnoff to the reservoir. I never take it, but I can't help but glance down the road, half expecting to see something or someone standing there, watching. The reservoir is overgrown now. The paths we once walked hidden under layers of weeds and brush. It's as if the place itself is trying to erase the memories, to swallow up the evidence of what happened there. But no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget that night. The reservoir may be silent now, its waters calm and untroubled, but I know what lies beneath. I've learned that some places are better left in the past, their secrets buried where they can't hurt anyone else. And as for those figures in the dark, I hope they never find another set of eyes to witness their grim activities. Because once you've seen what we saw, you're never quite the same. Somewhere out there, the truth is still hidden, wrapped up in the darkness of that night and the depths of the reservoir. And as much as I try to leave it behind, I know that a part of me will always be standing on that rocky outcrop, watching the bags disappear into the water, and wondering what might have happened if my phone hadn't rung. It's a question I'll never have the answer to, and maybe that's for the best. The childhood woods incident. Growing up, our house was the go-to spot for all our hangouts. There were a few reasons for this. We had a big basement decked out with everything a group of teenagers could want: an old pool table, a decent sound system, and a stash of beer that my dad never seemed to miss. But the real draw was the woods behind our house. They stretched for miles, wild and untamed, and led to a secluded reservoir that felt like our own private playground. For my friends and me, Chester, Rick, Jasper, Hassan, and myself, the woods and the reservoir were places of adventure, freedom, and more than a little mischief. On a warm evening in late summer, we found ourselves, once again, in my basement. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, but the air was still thick with the lingering heat of the day. We were playing pool, the thump of electronic dance music filling the space, when Chester suggested we take a hike through the woods to the reservoir. The idea was met with immediate enthusiasm. We were restless, bored of the confines of the basement, and the promise of a nighttime adventure was too good to pass up. We grabbed a few beers, slipped out the back door, and headed into the woods. The path to the reservoir was one we had traversed countless times. It was marked by trampled underbrush and faint trails that only we knew, winding through the trees in a haphazard, but familiar way. The woods had always felt like an extension of my backyard, a place where we could do whatever we wanted, away from the rules and restrictions of the adult world. The hike was easy at first, the ground still soft from a rainstorm earlier in the week. We walked in a loose formation, Chester and Rick leading the way with Jasper and Hassan close behind. I brought up the rear, enjoying the cool breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. The night was dark but clear, the moonlight filtering through the canopy and casting eerie, shifting patterns on the forest floor. We joked and laughed as we went, the kind of mindless chatter that comes naturally among friends who have known each other forever. As we approached the reservoir, the familiar chain link fence came into view. It had been there for as long as I could remember, a flimsy barrier meant to keep people out. But over the years, we had cut so many holes in it that slipping through was second nature. We ducked through one of our makeshift gaps, and suddenly we were on the other side, standing at the edge of the reservoir. The water was dark and still, reflecting the moon and stars like a vast, liquid mirror. We made our way along the shoreline, heading for the cliff on the near side of the reservoir. It was a spot we often hung out, a steep, rocky outcrop that offered a good view of the water and the surrounding woods. From up there, you could see the whole reservoir stretching out below, quiet and undisturbed. We settled down on the rocks, passing around the beers and talking about nothing in particular. It was just another night at our favorite spot, or so we thought. After a while, the usual sense of relaxation settled over us, the cool night air and the soothing sound of the water putting everyone at ease. We watched the occasional ripple break the reservoir surface, likely caused by a fish or some other unseen creature. The reservoir, with its stillness and isolation, felt like it belonged entirely to us. But then, just as we were starting to get comfortable, Hassan noticed something. He was the first to see it, a faint glow on the far side of the reservoir, barely visible through the trees. At first, we dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from a distant car's headlights or a campfire from some other group of teens who had discovered the reservoir. But as we watched, the glow grew brighter, flickering like a series of small lights moving through the woods. It wasn't a single, steady light, but several points of light, bobbing and weaving as they made their way closer to the water. "What the hell is that?" Jasper muttered, his voice low and uneasy. None of us had an answer. We stared across the water, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The lights continued to move, slow and deliberate, until they reached the shore. There, in the moonlight, we could make out the silhouettes of several figures. They were carrying flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness and casting long, eerie shadows. It was impossible to see their faces from where we were, but there was something about their movements that felt off, too synchronized, too purposeful. We watched in silence as the figures gathered by the water's edge, their flashlights darting around as if searching for something. One by one, they began to lower large, heavy bags into the water. The bags floated for a moment before sinking slowly, disappearing beneath the surface without a trace. The scene played out with a disturbing calmness, each movement deliberate and practiced. It was like watching a ritual, something rehearsed and repeated. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. The bags, the figures, the way they moved, it all pointed to something sinister. My stomach churned, a knot of dread forming as the realization set in. This wasn't just some kids messing around. This was something darker, something that didn't belong in our reservoir, in our woods. "Guys, we need to go," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no argument. The unspoken agreement hung in the air, whatever was happening on the other side of the reservoir. We didn't want any part of it. We scrambled to our feet, moving as quietly as we could. The figures across the water hadn't noticed us yet, and we intended to keep it that way. But as we turned to leave, Hassan tripped on a loose rock, sending it skittering down the cliffside and into the water below. The sound echoed loudly in the still night, and in an instant, every flashlight across the reservoir swung in our direction. "Go, go, go," I hissed, the urgency in my voice unmistakable. We bolted, sprinting away from the cliff and back towards the fence. The woods, usually so familiar, now felt like a maze of shadows and obstacles. Branches snagged at our clothes, roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't dare slow down. Behind us, we could hear the shouts and the rapid crunch of footsteps as the figures gave chase. The realization that they were coming after us, that we were being hunted, sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. My heart pounded in my ears as I ran, every breath feeling like fire in my lungs. The fear was unlike anything I had ever felt, a raw, primal terror that urged me to keep moving, to not look back. I could hear the others close behind, their footsteps heavy and frantic. We reached the fence, and in the darkness, it took precious seconds to find the gap we had come through. One by one, we squeezed through, the sharp metal scraping against our skin, but there was no time to care. Once on the other side, we kept running, tearing through the woods with reckless abandon. The sounds of our pursuers faded, but we didn't stop until we burst out into the open space of my backyard. We collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling from the exertion and fear. The reality of what had just happened was too much to process. We had gone to the reservoir 100 times, but never had it been like this. Never had it been dangerous. Hassan fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to dial 911. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, calm and detached, as we tried to explain what we had seen. I could tell she didn't fully understand. How could she? But she promised to send a squad car to my house immediately and to have officers check out the reservoir. We hung up and sat there in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us like a physical force. When the police arrived, they took our statements and began to search the area. I watched as they moved through the woods, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness, just like the figures we had seen at the reservoir. I felt a chill run down my spine when they called us over to the fence. There, clearly visible in the moonlight, were muddy footprints leading right up to the edge of my backyard. They were fresh, the impressions deep and unmistakable. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions serious. They asked if we were sure the prints weren't ours, but we all shook our heads. We hadn't come that way. Whoever had been chasing us had followed us right up to the fence, stopping just short of my property. The thought sent a shiver through me how close they had come, how close we had been to. What? Being caught? Being silenced? The police promised to keep an eye on the area, but days went by with no word. The reservoir, once a place of freedom and fun, now felt off limits, contaminated by the events of that night. We avoided it, choosing instead to hang out in safer, more familiar places. My parents, worried about our safety, considered moving. My mom swore she saw figures near the woods at night, and once she even claimed to hear voices. Whether it was real or just her imagination, none of us could say for sure. Then, about a week later, the news broke. The police had discovered 3 bodies in the reservoir, all wrapped in garbage bags. The story was all over the local news, and our quiet town was thrown into a frenzy. The police launched a full investigation, but no arrests were made, and no further details were released to the public. It was as if the case had hit a dead end, leaving us with more questions than answers. For my friends and me, life changed after that. The reservoir, once a place of joy and adventure, was now a place of fear and mystery. We never went back, the memories of that night too fresh, too raw. It was as if the reservoir had been tainted, its waters hiding something dark and unspoken. Even now, years later, I still think about it, the figures, the bags, the chase through the woods. It's a memory that lingers, a reminder that even the most familiar places can harbor secrets. We've all gone our separate ways since then, but every now and then we'll bring up the reservoir. We'll talk about that night, about how close we came to something. We still don't know who those figures were or why they were there. The police never shared the full details, and the case remains unsolved. It's a mystery that, to this day, haunts the back of my mind. Sometimes when I'm driving through my old neighborhood, I'll pass by the turnoff to the reservoir. The fence is still there, taller and more reinforced than before, the gaps we cut long since repaired. But I know that beyond the fence, the reservoir remains, its surface calm and still, hiding whatever lies beneath. It's a place I'll never visit again, but it's also a place I'll never forget. The reservoir is part of my past, a chapter that I can't close, no matter how much I try. And so, life goes on, the memories fading but never disappearing entirely. The reservoir, the figures, the chase, it's all still there, lurking in the recesses of my mind, a reminder of the night when our safe haven became a place of danger. We were lucky to get away, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't. It's a question that will never have an answer, but maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left undisturbed. For now, I've learned to stick to the paths I know, to avoid the places that set my instincts on edge. The world is full of unknowns, and sometimes it's better to stay on the safe side of the fence. Because once you've crossed it, once you've seen what we saw, you're never quite the same. The reservoir is just a body of water, but to me, it will always be a reminder that there's darkness out there, even in the places you think you know best.